to the ECG BroadWorks webinar. We're thrilled to have Scott Hoffpauir on as a special guest joining us this week. So we'll get to talk to him in just a few minutes. But who's ECG in the first place? So ECG makes the network work is one of the things we say about ourselves. So this is some of our customers here from across different training and engineering projects that we've been doing. We help companies with choosing the right software, mostly for service provider networks. So these are internet service providers, data center operators, voice service providers, enterprise environments, and then training and operation support. So doing ongoing support around the clock, sometimes with security monitoring for voice and data networks both. So this is just a handful of some of the clients that we have worked with over the past few years, including some in the public sector side and large scale service providers and a good many enterprises as well. So our panelists today, you can see us all here. Sherwin Crown has been at ECG about as long as I have been, since 2003. He's a senior member of technical staff and one of our vice presidents. So welcome, Sherwin. Thanks for jumping on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Brian Tate is another senior member of technical staff. He comes to us from the world of electrical engineering. So we're glad to have his. He's our nod to diversity in our academic background. So welcome, Brian. Glad to have you on with us.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
John Claiborne is another senior member of technical staff, and I suppose he's sort of slightly different. It's like the where you have all these different kinds of mathematicians. Well, he's a telecommunications engineer by original training, and another senior member of technical staff. Welcome, John.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And I am Mark Lindsay. I'm one of our vice presidents as well, and another senior member of technical staff. And we'd like to welcome Scott Hoffpauir, who's with True North Advisory right now, but he's probably famous in the BroadWorks world for what he did a little bit before that, a small project he had with Mike Tesler and a few others called BroadWorks and BroadCloud at BroadSoft. He was one of the co-founders of BroadSoft and went from there to Cisco. We'll give you a little bit more of his background. But Scott, we're thrilled to have you on. Thanks for making the time to join us today.
Thanks, Mark. Happy to be here.
So we start off on our BroadWorks quarterly roundup with some top news in the world of BroadWorks. So we're going to be looking today a little bit of focus on some of the business news, some of the growth of BroadWorks and sort of the decline of BroadWorks, and we'll be talking with Scott about that a little bit more. But let's get the debate started. John, take us away.
Yeah, so Scott Hoffpauir, who is here, he published a blog article in March. He was describing how he sees the cloud-only providers like RingCentral and 8x8 displacing the conventional service providers. While the service providers are better at scaling sales and marketing than they are at innovating, he also predicts that the next generation of solutions will not only be mobile first, but they'll probably be mobile only as well. Now we're excited to speak more with Scott later in today's webinar.
Sherwin, what you got?
Sherwin, to you.
Oh yeah. So in other news, so there's a telecom news site, No Jitter. They reported an interview about AT&T. Basically, the news there is that AT&T is discontinuing their Collaborate service. And so what they found out was with the whole COVID issue and folks being at home, that AT&T kind of decommissioned their Collaborate service in the middle of the pandemic. And so they were left with having to find alternative means to actually get that done. So what the takeaway there from that article was that there are a lot of folks like engineers like ourselves on this conference call that are basically saying that, for the most part, they don't really feel a hit if the voice service goes away because we do most of our stuff on video conferencing or those kind of things. But for other folks, such as, like the managers and the other support staff, and sales folks for that matter, their voice methods, or their standard voice methods are the ones that they really need the most. So they still find that to be a critical endeavor.
Brian, you're muted.
My apologies. Telecom consultant Peter Verduzzi reported that customers are making new long-term agreements with Cisco to buy licenses. However, he remains skeptical about the long-term prospects for BroadWorks in light of Cisco's push for WebEx. He did note that Zoom rapidly added 1 million Zoom phone users with their price tag of just $10 per user per month, which is far below the typical price of about $32 or $37.20 just from a couple of years ago.
In contrast to what Sherwin was saying about AT&T, Verizon's OneTalk service, which is built on BroadWorks and the native cellular capabilities, that continues to expand. One analyst described OneTalk as transformative, calling it an important first step for the mobile, that is cellular communication industry. So in February, research firm Frost & Sullivan, they recognized Verizon as a leader among business communication service providers, specifically citing the BroadWorks-based OneTalk service.
Yeah, and in addition to that, in 2020, I mean, Vonage actually reported an increase in their revenue growth from the BroadWorks-based, platform that they're running. I know they had a new, I think it was a CEO or CIO, I think, who actually went in and started to change up some things, and it looks like their revenues are going up, so things are going well for them.
It's also been reported that TPX, the merger formed of two BroadWorks operators, Telepacific and DSCI, they're reported to be one of the first service providers really going big with their WebEx for deployment for BroadWorks in terms of the integration.
And then this month, Evolve IP, they announced a new service by which Microsoft Teams capabilities are provided along with the voice capabilities through their BroadWorks platform. This is added to their existing WebEx-based capabilities. They report that 62% of the meetings market is dominated by a combination of Microsoft Teams and WebEx. Those two together make up 62% of the meetings market.
It's interesting. On another note there, we also, from our research, we saw that not every service provider is actually doing as well as Vonage and the other folks. I mean, for example, we saw that Cox Communications, their revenue growth was nearly flat. So they only reported like a 1% growth in their business service from last year.
More news from the industry. Provider 14 IP, they're a service provider focused on the hospitality industry, and they cover nearly 250,000 hotel rooms. They've announced that they've acquired a geo-redundant BroadWorks platform with data centers in both the United States and in Europe.
And then Florida-based service provider Cloud Communication Concepts, or C3, they announced that in January that they are doing a geo-redundant expansion of their network. They have servers in Miami and Las Vegas. And then C3 also outlined that they are using Cisco UCS for their server hardware, VMware for virtualization, and then Oracle session border controllers.
Thanks, guys. Next, we're going to talk about some of the new integrations that are in the space. These are companies that offer software products that they've added or expanded their BroadWorks support here lately.
First one is ECG's own software, Alpaca, was updated for the latest BroadWorks releases, and it provides network management, bulk provisioning, a user self-care portal, and a plug-in extension framework to give BroadSoft operators all the tools they need. Alpaca has been deployed in a number of service providers, including CenturyLink and AT&T, along with government agencies, where it aids in the security compliance for the BroadWorks platform.
Yeah, we've also discovered some other companies that are making use of SIPREC. So we have like Verba, which is a Verint Systems financial compliance capture tool. And then there's also Numonix, which is a recite call recording software, where they've recently released support for SIPREC for call recording.
Several business support tools got expanded BroadWorks capabilities recently. Some of those being Uboss, TotalView, Imagicle, and Netaxis. And this is part of a continuing trend in the expansion of BroadWorks automation by firms that are based outside the US as well.
And Kakapo Systems released a new version of their Unity mobile app for BroadWorks, adding new integration with their popular Salesforce customer relationship management software, their CRM software. And the tool provides a mobile app merging BroadWorks features with a Salesforce integration.
Yeah, and also TekVizion actually did integration, which is an integration testing firm, actually announced an offering for automated testing for WebEx for BroadWorks. So that could prove useful too.
In January, Cisco themselves, they published a new reference for branch office topology for doing the integration of any BroadWorks-based service provider with Cisco's Meraki product line. This is one of the first Cisco approved and documented combinations of BroadWorks with other Cisco products.
Yeah, in addition to that, we have Yealink and Sonome, where Yealink actually released recent documentation about their busy lamp field integration. And then Sonome actually introduced a new line of desk phones and desk stations as well.
Yeah, so lots of investment there from a lot of different companies to improve their compatibility with BroadWorks. Some of the BroadWorks changes coming from Cisco themselves included the migration from Exchange to the Cisco site. So that's been an ongoing thing. And Brian Tate is going to bring us some coverage of those new tools a little bit later in our webinar. John, tell us about some of the other things that are going on.
Yeah, so Cisco is releasing some details of the features that are coming in BroadWorks release 25. BroadWorks is investing in development to make the application servers more efficient at handling large numbers of subscriptions for the various information services like Busy Lamp Field or XSI Call Control, Meet Me conferencing, other popular end user features that we all know and love. And a new feature slated for release 25 allows the operators to better identify devices that are generating many new subscriptions so that misbehaving clients can be found and dealt with.
An additional feature is voicemail protection enhancements as well. So what we're seeing here is that the BroadWorks platform is actually releasing or planning to release a new version of voicemail protection, where what they're doing is they are assuming that mobile devices are secure, being that you have to use passcodes or biometrics to actually get into those devices. And so what they're doing is allowing you to bypass your voicemail PIN logins on your mobile devices, while still allowing you to enter a PIN on your physical devices, since you don't use biometrics to access those.
Yeah, that's an interesting shift towards a mobile preference, I think.
Like a mobile first,
coming out of there, which is not unrelated to what Scott was writing about. We're excited to have Scott Hoffpauir join us on the webinar today. Give a little bit more of an introduction for some of you who haven't got a chance to meet him or work with Scott when he was at Cisco and BroadSoft before that. He's the co-founder and chief technology officer at BroadSoft. And over the course of 20 years at BroadSoft, he ran product strategy and development, cloud operations, support, and customer success for their flagship products at BroadSoft, which were BroadWorks and BroadCloud. After Cisco's acquisition of BroadSoft, he joined Cisco in 2018 as a vice president of Cloud Calling Technology Group. So there he was responsible for all of Cisco's cloud calling products and solutions, including product strategy, product management, development, cloud operations, and partner support. And at ECG, I'll say, we've known Scott and his team to build a competent team. So the folks who build the software are obviously really bright. The BroadWorks platform They know how to build robust software that meets real needs and keep that product going, evolve it over decades, support it in really challenging environments. And so we have a high respect for Scott's leadership and his ability to build a technical team and then keep it going. I know a lot of the folks that worked for you, Scott, at BroadSoft had long tenures and were bringing a lot of innovations and a lot of just really solid support to their products. And so we've really benefited from that, I think, and the industry has in general from that kind of behind the scenes software supporting, including, and in addition to the front of scene, the hot new features that you guys got to talk about back at the BroadSoft Connection show. But we thank you for joining us, Scott. We're glad to have you here.
Oh, my pleasure, Mark. Thank you.
So first big question, you wrote a blog piece, I'll flash up here, that really was, I want to just give you a chance to talk about it a little bit. You wrote a blog piece where you talked about a customer who asked you about replacing BroadWorks, and you brought up some of your thoughts that kind of came in response to that. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, one of the ex-BroadSoft sales guys reached out to me about an incumbent telco in South America that was, I guess, uncomfortable with the positioning from Cisco, and they asked about replacing BroadWorks and what the possibilities were. So it kind of got me to thinking. And one of the things I based the blog on was just kind of what's happened in our industry over the last 30 or 40 years or so. I started my career working on Class 5 switches at Nartel. And, when we started BroadSoft, it was really about, we could do this a lot better. We can use voice over IP, and we could really make this a much better solution, much more economical, user-friendly. And then, I think we were quite successful there, and I'm quite proud of what we did there. And then, eventually the industry kind of moved more into providing SaaS services, and at BroadSoft we introduced Broad Cloud to address that. And then vendors like RingCentral and Zoom came around, to provide similar functionality. And I guess the point of the blog was, it does seem like the industry is ripe for the next evolution, and I'm not quite sure what that's going to be, but I've been talking to a lot of people about things like mobile. It does seem like 10, 20 years ago the PSTN was first and mobile is second. I think now mobile is first and PSTN is second, and everyone has a smartphone. You've got new technology like multi-SIM and eSIM capabilities that allow you to have dual persona on your phone. It certainly seems like that's a big area. Another one that I think is quite interesting is a focus on frontline workers. Most of the UC solutions are focused on knowledge workers, and they represent 20 to 25% of the market, where frontline workers represent 75 to 80% of the market. So, I expect to see UC solutions kind of customized for different verticals. You may have one for manufacturing, construction, healthcare, retail, and you start seeing very vertical specific offers that integrate, communications with all of the other apps that those verticals require. And then, clearly, things like BroadWorks and even RingCentral, we're replacing PBXs, and those PBXs were old, right? So a lot of that feature functionality isn't really required anymore, with the emergence of messaging and meetings and mobility. A lot of those features are antiquated, and you don't really need that stuff anymore. And I think there's an opportunity to simplify the user experience and kind of optimize. So that was really what I was getting at in the blog. Not to say that BroadWorks is dead. I don't think that's the case. I just think our industry kind of goes through different cycles and phases, and BroadWorks was at the lead of one of those phases.
Right.
And oftentimes, things aren't black and white. So
Yeah, you mean black and white on the transition from one phase to the other. There's some
Yes.
overlap between them.
I mean, clearly there's still class 5 switches around, so
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I was just speaking to an engineer who was talking about the 911 selective routers around the country, or many of them are DMS 100s. So that's interesting. Thanks for sharing that. John, you had a question to get us started.
Yeah, thank you. So Scott, in that article, you wrote about the changes from generation 3, and generation 3 being software as a service or SaaS, like we talked about, to whatever is next. Mobile first, probably mobile only, simple and straightforward, focusing on features that matter. Those were some great words that you shared there. I think that was really great to talk in that line. We have this is a webinar about BroadWorks, and that's who's here. And so, is there anything that you would say to a service provider or people running a BroadWorks platform who's thinking about the future?
Well, like I said, I'm probably not the person to comment on what the future of BroadWorks is from a release schedule and anything like that. But I think from an industry standpoint, it's probably less about technology and more about what you're offering the end user. There's certainly the bar has been raised over the years, and when you look out there, people expect bundled solutions and unified user experiences and rich set of functionality, with a lot of I guess optimize user experience using AI and machine learning and things like that. So I think it's probably important for people using the underlying BroadWorks technology to think about not just the telephony, but what else am I going to offer in the market? I mean, there's messaging, there's meetings, there's contact center capabilities, and I think more and more the expectation is that you have kind of the full suite. So to me, the BroadWorks platform provides great telephony. I mean, probably more than you actually need. But what about all the other stuff that's out there, and how do you kind of bring all that together? And one of the things that we've worked with a number of clients on is kind of what's the next generation managed service provider look like? It's probably going to be piecing together all these different SaaS services, putting your own user experience on top of it, and kind of showing how it all works together. So that's probably the types of things I would say are the most important.
Great, thank you. That's super helpful.
And that really sounds, Scott, like what you're talking about are the kinds of things that TPX is talking about, trying to sort of bundle. They're going with the WebEx for BroadWorks way of doing things, but put those things together so that all those your messaging and collaboration and calling is all in a single offer. And Evolve IP is doing the same kind of thing, but they're taking kind of a Microsoft Teams centric approach. And those sound to me like a little bit like the some of the examples of maybe the kind of way that you're describing it.
I mean, look, I think the complexity of BroadWorks is it's quite high, and I think what operators can do to enhance it is really more of a focus on the user experience, right? Whether that's web portals or desktop apps or mobile apps, and how do you what does the end user see? Because I think that's really where the success of your offer is going to be most important, right? I mean, end users have high expectations these days, and you can go online, you can easily trial something, and I think that's really the challenge. I think is how do you do that? I don't think anyone wants to develop telephony from scratch. I mean, that's pretty hard to do. And, there are some open source things out there that have some of those capabilities, but even that is pretty hard to do. So, and I think you only have so much time and money to invest as a service provider. And, to me, it should be more on the user experience.
Brian, Sherwin, you guys have any thoughts?
I agree. I think I agree. There's definitely a change in the end user expectations from other technologies and from generational influences. And so all the complexity in the world is not necessarily going to make it a better user experience. So I'm interested to see how that transforms things.
Yeah, I think I agree with what was being discussed here. I think that the trial period and I think that's a new fad that came about where this generation is used to trying everything, and so to get them to sign up for something is a major feat, without providing something for free. So I think I agree with what was being said there. Yeah.
Right. Scott, let me ask you this. In your piece, you mentioned, some of the SaaS generation, the Ring Central 8x8, now the Zoom Phone, those kind of folks. In my mind, I often will think of those kind of companies as being more or less doing the same thing as a lot of BroadWorks service providers. So a lot of BroadWorks service providers, they're providing telephony. They have different options in terms of what kind of apps or how they're going to bundle it with other features. But at the end of the day, these other companies they're employing their own engineering teams and developing their own products and software. So they have a proprietary platform. They run the whole software development organization, or else they go to a company like Cisco or Microsoft and buy their product, and they get somebody else's software development organization. Do you think that's an accurate way to look at it? That in both cases, programmers are being employed, products are being managed. It's just in one case you're doing it all internally, and in another case you're doing it externally. And what's the judgment call? How are people making that decision, do you think?
Well, I mean, I always thought, the difference between a service provider running BroadWorks and Ring Central has probably got nothing to do with the features and functionality, but more to do with the digital marketing. How do you generate awareness about your solution? How do you allow someone to, learn about the offer? How do you let somebody buy it online? How do you onboard them really simply and things like that? So, I think looking backwards, when we competed against Ring Central at BroadSoft, I think we always had a better feature set. That was never the issue. I think what we probably lacked was that digital marketing expertise and engine, that kind of goes around it. So, and that's really the secret to SaaS, right? It's, how effectively can you generate awareness and close a lead and optimize your digital marketing spend and your SEO and all that sort of stuff. So to me, that's the big part. And I think, quite frankly, I think a lot of service providers struggle with that. That's just not necessarily what they're good at,
Right. They were organized in many cases around a pretty waterfall style sales and onboarding provisioning process that required, in many cases, a truck roll to go install something. And it seems like in many organizations that's still kind of baked into the sales processes, that there will be a clear, customer relationship with kind of a multi-week schedule.
Yeah, I mean, imagine, if you're a small business, maybe it's different today, but 5 or 10 years ago, you'd probably call Verizon or AT&T to get your phone service, right? So, it's like, okay, that's who I call, and that's where the likes of a Ring Central really had to generate awareness that there was an alternative solution. Mm-hmm. So, service providers would have, they'd have call centers, and you would call in and say, hey, I need phone service. I just started a business. I need 3 lines. And, then they would walk you through your options. And that's how, in fact, today, that's still how it works.
Yeah. With the classic service providers.
Yeah.
Yeah, Scott, you mentioned earlier trying to focus on user experience and making things as seamless as possible for the users. And, we talked in the hot news about these service providers who are doing integrations with their BroadSoft platform, be it Teams, WebEx. I think the goal is to offer some of those things, offer those tools that allow them to have a mobile interface that's simple and easy to use. What do you think are the characteristics of service providers who are doing those integrations well versus those who aren't doing them well? Do you see any unifying characteristics there?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with focus, more from a sales and marketing standpoint, right? I mean, it's providing a telephony solution covers a lot of ground. I mean, you've got different segments, you have different verticals. So, I think especially as a smaller service provider, you really got to think about where do you want to focus. Selling to an enterprise is going to be completely different than selling to an SMB. In fact, the feature sets are going to be quite different. So, and I think when you look at what others have, oftentimes they have different offers based on different segments, right? They may have a micro business segment, an SMB, an enterprise. Like go to the Comcast business website, and you'll probably see 3 or 4, and that's because they're all tailored to those different segment sizes. So, and then I think within there, like I was saying before, to me, the next level will definitely be specialization, right? There's a service provider, I don't think they're a BroadWorks service provider, called Weave, that focuses on dentist offices. So it sounds kind of weird, but they've integrated telephony with all the appointment scheduling and reminder system and billing and all this other stuff. So they give a dentist office kind of a one-stop shop for everything they need to be productive. Because, if you're a dentist, you don't want to worry about all of that stuff, right? I mean, that's just overhead. So if somebody else can help you do all that, then, you're probably going to be more likely to go and buy a service from them.
My experience with dentists is that they're, I've known a lot of nerds who were dentists, and they seem to be some of the most technologically astute people that I knew in my hometown. For some reason, maybe it's just the particular batch of dentists I was around, but and in a certain sense, it's not surprising that there would be a whole service provider built for them. So it's a good point and evidence of your point that they exist. So, what are some of the exciting things you mentioned in your piece that, you're thinking about? There's some interesting new things that they could be coming on beyond just the PBX type services, some things we could integrate with AI. Have you seen anything interesting that you really thought, oh, that's a really clever, basically a new tool based on some of the new technology that's available that goes beyond what people think of when they hear the word PBX?
Yeah, I mean, I think AI has always been a bit of a struggle, and just the classic PBX feature set. Now, I think once you get into contact centers, it's a whole different story. Being able to capture every interaction and get insights from all of those interactions and use that for agent coaching or customer satisfaction improvements or what have you. I mean, that's pretty big. So, recording every call, getting the intents from those calls, the sentiment, all that sort of stuff. I mean, you can imagine you can do some pretty cool things with that. I think when it comes to just regular PBX features, it's a little harder to figure out, where AI fits. But clearly you could still have transcription and, being able to summarize the subject of your call for you. So, in your call logs, not only do you have the phone numbers and the dates and the time and the duration, but you could have, subject and what you discussed. So I think those are some kind of interesting things.
For sure. Yeah, contact center seems like, my impression has been it's a really growing space, even as some other, like you mentioned, knowledge workers is a kind of a segment of the market that UCaaS and hosted PBX is really focused on. Contact center space has really taken off in this, especially there's been a big contrast in 2020, I think, as as folks moved a lot onto video meetings very heavily. Even the article that Sherwin was referring us to, where you had the RRD, which is a marketing company. They were talking about basically on the contact center side, the customer service side, the voice was more important than ever. They had a lot of interactions over voice calls. Whereas it seems like my perception has been that there's a trend on the to grow and expand contact centers, really, and lots of different forms of contact center, lots of different channels. But that seems like that's been a real growth area. Are you seeing any particular interesting players in that space, or anybody that's doing anything interesting that really stands out to you that you think is worth highlighting?
Well, it is a red hot space for sure. We've done a few private equity engagements and helping private equity firms kind of look at the contact center space and bring together vendors and combine them and so forth. The shift to the cloud probably hasn't happened as fast in the contact center space as a lot of people think. So it's still very much prem-based. So there's still a great opportunity there. And then most of the contact center guys really struggle with the AI side of it. And what you find is, they just use the underlying technology from Google, Microsoft, or Amazon, right? And what they're really doing is just putting a nice application around it, right? But the underlying technology all comes from those three big vendors. So I think it's more about how do you take that technology and solve a problem than it is, whiz bang technology, right?
Right. How do you actually put these things to work in ways that help them be more successful, that they can understand and manage? Well, Scott, thanks for giving us this time and talking through it. I hope you'll be able to stay on as we move into our next section, but we really appreciate your time and willingness to chat on our panel and talk about your article. It really was thought-provoking, and I know it's brought up a lot of discussion here at our company, and I'm sure a lot of others. So thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate the invitation.
So we're going to jump next into some new tools for BroadWorks. So Brian Tate has done some research for us. He's going to show us some things that are applicable for BroadWorks service providers.
Thank you, Mark. And I want to say thanks again to Scott for doing this. Really was a pleasure. So I'm going to go through pretty rapidly some things that might help BroadWorks operators with some tools that Cisco's providing and tweaking and developing. So this focuses on what I'm calling the Cisco catalog of tools. It's right now, it's been there for a long time. It's been used by different Cisco service providers and customers, and it runs the gamut from all their different product lines. So you'll see things in there for routers, for switches, for their voice solutions that predate the BroadWorks acquisition. You'll see lots of different things in there. There's three in particular that I'll highlight first. And Mark, if you'll advance or click, there you go. The green ones that you see there, the dial number analyzer for Cube, the IP subnet calculator, and the voice codec bandwidth calculator, those sound like they might be helpful, but there's still some more development there that probably needs to be done there to make it really BroadWorks operator friendly. We'll come back to that. And the blue ones there are the ones that I expect you'll probably start interacting with if you haven't already interacted with it, and you may not realize that they're part of their support tool suite. So going back to the green ones real quick, what I'm calling the lesser tools for now, the dial number analyzer, Mark, if you'll advance one more for me. The dial number analyzer was intended for their Cisco Unified Border Element, their Cube. And if you look at it, it has some similarities to the BroadWorks VTR and VTRI tools that you may be familiar from the network server and the application server, where you can provide a SIP message or a caller and a callee, and it does some translations work for you. Well, I think there's some potential there that they could do something similar there as well, because but the difference is that it takes a configuration also. So instead of running the tool on your server, this is like a simulator where you load the configuration of your device and then add the SIP message or the calling information and then press go, and it does a simulation for you. The IP subnet calculator strangely only supports IPv4, which makes it kind of shows its age, but it could be a tool that helps some voice operators that need that reminder of where the subnet boundaries are. Also, the voice codec bandwidth calculator, I find that to be a little bit dated as well. It doesn't have all the modern codecs that you might expect, but it does take into account calculating bandwidth for different types of layer 2 headers or the data link headers. So you could choose different ones in there and set different parameters and tweak it. And then, so I think those have a potential for the future, but I'm going to transition now to some other tools that I think you'll have immediate application for. The first one is the download software tool, or they call it a DS tool. This is actually a link to where you can start to download software for BroadWorks on the new support portal. So you can transition away from Exchange if you haven't already and start looking for your software there on the downloads software portal. The other tool generally on this slide that I'm mentioning is something I'll come back to later called the Collaboration Solutions Analyzer, or the CSA. There's a sub tool in there called the SRV checker, which looks like it might have some future benefit as well for checking SRV records for WebEx for BroadWorks deployments and that sort of thing. So those using SAS and WebEx for BroadWorks might find that be a helpful tool in the future, especially on the implementation side. And we'll get back to that in a minute. So real quickly, I'm just curious, and you're welcome to respond back in the chat. Did you know that the BroadWorks Software Manager, while it continues to have that incrementing version number, also goes by a release independent designation now? I never heard that announced, but you'll find that if you go to the download software tool. They're still working on it and talking with some tech engineers. They're still trying to get some of the documentation to be at the same page as some of the software like you're used to in Exchange. So hold tight. There's another place to go for documentation in the meantime, but do note that for certain types of software, you'll have to go somewhere else for the release notes. Additional tools that I expect you'll use in the software suite are the Support Case Manager, or SCM. That's the primary place where you'll go to manage your trouble tickets, or what Cisco calls your support requests, or SRs. Also, that's one way to look at your tickets, and another way to open support requests and to manage those is something called My Devices, or the MD tool. It's an alternate place because it presents it graphically in a little bit different way. And for some customers or administrators, if you're trying to keep track of lots of different tickets, I find that can be a better interface for doing that, but they're interchangeable. If you open a ticket in one, you'll see it in the other, and vice versa. And then the third tool I wanted to mention is something called My Notifications, which doesn't have a little TLA acronym with it, but it's a way for you to subscribe to an RSS feed or email notifications of things that you really want to know as a BroadWorks operator. Things like field notices, security advisories, updates to software versions, bugs. And so that's something that I think is something to highlight and make sure you subscribe to that. And you can set it up at different levels for different products. So if you have some of their Cisco phones as well as BroadWorks, you can sign up separately to get those notifications in different ways. The next slide will show you an example of what that kind of looks like when that email comes to you. This next slide, Mark, is one I received this morning. So you'll see it's showing the software updates for BroadWorks that were released yesterday. And you'll see there's lots of different patches that came out. And so they sent out an email alert to me as an example. So earlier I said that there's several different support tools, and I highlighted some in green and some in blue. I'd like to highlight one here in red that we've talked a little bit about already. If you'll click that slide, I think we'll highlight the Collaboration Solutions Analyzer there near the top. And that's one that I mentioned is actually not just one tool, but it's 4 different subtools. On the next slide, it kind of shows you their architecture and their intent for those 4 different tools. And this is a image that's right in there. And if you go to the CSA, you'll see that they're trying to support not just operators, but also engineers and those that are implementing Cisco solutions. So the SRV checker is designed to be used by folks that are, you're testing it out, you're trying to figure out if you're set up right. The Collab Edge Validator, which isn't applicable to BroadWorks, but it's that same sort of a tool used for on the design end. The back-to-back call tester, the B2B call tester, is another tool that's not relevant for BroadWorks right now, but it's starting to get into more of the operator standpoint. And then the one that's really, I think, going to be the one to highlight is something that they call it log analysis. It's got 3 aims. It's to visualize the logs, to correlate data for you, and then automatically flag certain types of issues in your configuration or your system that might come up. So if you go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about it. Note that this just came out with support for BroadWorks just a couple months ago in January, and it's only for the log analysis subtool, and that's highlighted here. So how do you use the CSA? Well, there's 2 different ways that I think you'll use it most often. First one on the left side is the call analysis. So that's going to be for analyzing things like your execution server log files, so that you can come up with pretty ladder diagrams and you can filter calls that are presented in the logs to do some troubleshooting or to communicate with TAC. On the right-hand side, it's also a way to do some patch analysis. And while there are still patching is going away with a lot of the release independent servers, it's still useful for checking the software of those release independent servers, and also trying to get that same report that you used to be able to receive with the Exchange Online Patch Advisor. In fact, I even saw in the bottom right there, you'll see there's a notice now on the Online Patch Advisor, which actually provides you a link to the new CSA log analysis tool. So be on the lookout for that as well. So first, let's talk a little bit about the software level advisor, which was the one on the right on the prior slide, the one that takes the place of the Online Patch Advisor. And I'm just going to go through this real quickly, but there's a couple of notes. One is that unlike the Online Patch Advisor, the files are only kept for 8 hours. So when you upload something, you're not going to be able to come back tomorrow and see the same files. It's kind of just temporary storage while you do the analysis. Now you can always upload the same file later, but just keep in mind that it's not going to be there. It's not a good place to store files. On the next slide, it gives you kind of a picture of after you've uploaded the file, it'll present a screen that says available files, and you'll be able to choose the file or even just click on that little play button on the right, and it'll automatically run the analysis. After it runs the analysis, it'll spit out a couple of extra files that'll show up in the available files, but they're not terribly useful right now. Also note that in this available files list, you can't really individually delete files or download the files. So once you upload them, it's kind of it's just a push only repository. And last thing I'll say about the software level advisor is this is an example of kind of a report that it provides at the summary level. If you remember before, there was the summary level and then there was detailed reports that you could get. In order to get the detail reports, that little blue oval that says list of missing patches, that's the way to get that. Also keep in mind, there's not a way yet to download directly the software files, whether it be the software manager or the missing patches, or to create a patch bundle. They don't have that feature and functionality yet, but you can get a detailed report in HTML that's similar to what you're used to in the Online Patch Advisor. All right, now away from the software level advisor, where are those ladder diagrams? So this has sparked some interest in several of our customers as a tool that might be useful for operations and troubleshooting. You upload that execution server log similar to the way you uploaded the tech support file, and then you run analysis, and it immediately gives you the BroadWorks calls overview screen that will list out all the different calls. If it's a big file and you have lots of calling activity, then you can do searches in the boxes that you see there. And that's helpful. Then once you choose one, it'll actually give you the ability to look at the ladder diagram. There's some file type and size restrictions in this in this analysis of the calls overview. So be aware of that. Also, if you have a zipped up excess log file, it's not going to work currently. They don't have a way to unzip the gunzip file and then or gzip file and then do the analysis on it, but that may change. So real quickly, reviewing the CSA real quick before I go through a couple of other things. That's the URL there. There's some information and documentation, but it's relatively old. It doesn't include the BroadWorks support that came out in 2021. Also, all the work that you're doing is tied to your single sign-on, your Cisco CCO ID. So keep that in mind if you're working as a team. Two more notes in the bottom there about the PCAP files. You can export a PCAP file from the ladder diagram screen, but it does not preserve IP addresses, and it does not have any meaningful Ethernet headers. So just keep that in mind and treat it just as a SIP output. There's a couple other ways you can export the ladder diagram information as well, but I'm not going to cover those here. Finally,
for time, we've got Sherwin's coverage. Let's jump over and we'll get into that, and then we'll probably be able to come back to the some of the other tools that you've got some information on in a later webinar. But let's jump over and give Sherwin some time to talk about another new service that Cisco is providing that's pretty useful. Let me pull that one up here. So Sherwin Crown is going to talk about one of the new functions that's come out, secure device onboarding using activation code. So if you're familiar with, Polycom or Yealink zero touch provisioning, this is going to sound familiar, but it's actually got some real advantages for BroadWorks service providers.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So if we jump over to the slide here, so this feature here is for service providers that are currently deploying the Cisco MPP phones. So what this allows you to do is it allows you to simplify your workflow for provisioning on the BroadWorks users. And what that really means is that it's allowing you to, if you're running Cisco MPP phones, it allows you to provision a device for a user and not have to worry about inserting MAC addresses or anything like that. That's going to be automatically done for you using this feature. So you provision a device with a device type that supports automatic provisioning, and then we'll talk about that in a second. So before we get into that, this is a feature in release 24, but it's been backpatched into 22 and 23. And one of the things here is that for this to work, you're going to need to speak with your PM or somebody else at Cisco to actually get a Cisco account for integration. And the key information that you're going to need out of that is going to need a client ID, your client secret, and a refresh token. And that's actually provisioned in the XSP service. So if we jump over to the next slide there, at a high level, what we have here is we have the end user premise, that's going to be the user. We have the Cisco managed parts of this, which is the GDS, which is Global Discovery Service. And then we have the Common Identity Service, which is a guy that does authentication and authorization. And then we have, similar stuff that you're used to seeing in a service provider network, which is going to be the XSP with DMS, right, which is device management, and your application server for your provisioning stuff. But there's a new service that they included here, which was device activation in this. And so what we're seeing here is that the way this works is that when an XSP starts up with device activation and you actually have the provisioning done with Cisco, the XSP actually goes and registers off to the Common Identity Service, and that actually responds back with a token. And this token is provided so that it actually can interact with the GDS, right, which is a Global Discovery Service. So it goes off and it does this registration setup whenever the XSP restarts, and then it goes to the GDS. And so the key here is that when you actually provision something, as a service provider, if you look at this diagram here, is as an admin or a user, you would actually request an activation code. So by requesting the activation code, that means you created a new device. Select, I need an activation code. the AS goes off to the XSP for the device activation service and said, hey, can you go get me an activation code? And then that goes off and talks to GDS. And the GDS then comes back with an activation ID. And that activation ID is what the GDS actually comes with and provides the activation code. So the GDS actually takes that activation ID, combines it with other pieces of information, which includes a password, and that goes into the AS. And so what it does with that activation code is that user is now able to take that activation code and either, automatically provision by emailing it off to the end user, or, or provide it to them in some other fashion. That end user now punches in that code into the MPP, and then the MPP goes off back to the GDS. The GDS then looks up for the activation code, and then comes back and says, all right, so I found where you're at. You need to go talk to service provider XYZ over here. And so it sends them off to the device activation service on that service provider. And so what that actually happens there is that the device then goes and interacts with the device activation service for the service provider. It does the secure remote password handshake, which includes the 8-digit password on the back end. And then once that happens, the device activation service then takes the MAC address out of that device and pipes it down to the application server and provisions a MAC address for that user. So it kind of binds them back up together, right? And then once the AS confirms that that's actually been built properly, it goes off and sends a redirection back to the device and says, all right, you need to go back to the XSP and talk to the device management service. And so he comes into the device management service and he authenticates there, and his device is automatically filled out and built for him. And so he comes back and register, and voila, you got a working phone. So instead of working with zero-touch provisioning and manually entering MAC addresses and doing other stuff like the other folks are doing, what they're doing is integrating the whole thing. So you, from a service provider on the BroadWorks service, just request the code. It goes and does its magic, gets the code back for you, the activation code. You send that off to the user. User punches that into his device, and voila, you're registered and off and going.
Cool, so Sherman, thanks for that. Thanks for that overview. I know we didn't have tons of time for that, but we appreciate you going through that. It does sound like that'll be a really useful new service. So thanks to all of you guys for joining in and for what you shared. Thanks, Scott, especially for joining us today. John, Brian, Sherwin, I appreciate your input and details here. Hope to see you guys all in a couple of months as we do our next BroadWorks webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.